I wasn't supposed to be home that early. It was a rare, quiet day at the office, and with a small smile, I decided to surprise my wife, Melissa. I imagined the look on her face when I walked through the door unannounced. Maybe we could have an early dinner together, or take a walk around the neighborhood like we used to in the early days of our marriage. But as I pulled into the driveway, something felt off. The house seemed too quiet, too still. A strange sensation crawled up my spine, a whisper of something dark lurking beneath the surface of normalcy. I shook it off, grabbed my briefcase, and headed inside. The door creaked open, and I stepped into the entryway. The house was unusually silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes your heart beat a little faster. I called out her name, "Melissa?" But there was no response. Then I heard it. A muffled laugh, followed by a low voice, too low to be hers. My heart pounded in my chest as I followed the sounds up the stairs, my footsteps eerily quiet on the carpeted floor. I knew where the voices were coming from, but I refused to believe it. The door to our bedroom was slightly ajar. I pushed it open just enough to see inside, and the world as I knew it shattered in an instant. There they were, Melissa and Eric, my best friend, tangled in the sheets, oblivious to everything but each other. The sight was like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of me. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my hands tightening into fists at my sides. 9 years. For 9 years, I had been married to this woman. For 9 years, Eric had been like a brother to me. And for 9 years, they had been betraying me behind my back. The realization hit me like a freight train, crushing everything in its path. I wanted to burst into the room, to scream, to confront them right then and there. But something stopped me. A cold, calculating voice in the back of my mind whispered for me to wait. There would be no screaming, no immediate confrontation. No, I would make them pay. But I would do it on my terms. Quietly, I backed away from the door and walked down the stairs. My mind was already working, the wheels of vengeance beginning to turn. I didn't know how long it would take or how far I would go, but one thing was certain: they would regret the day they ever crossed me. I left the house as quietly as I had entered, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing at the corners of my mouth. The game had just begun. Driving away from the house, I could still feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins, my thoughts a chaotic whirlwind of anger, pain, and disbelief. The image of Melissa and Eric entwined in our bed played on a loop in my mind, each replay a fresh stab to the heart. But I forced myself to stay calm, to keep my hands steady on the wheel. This wasn't the time for rash decisions or emotional outbursts. If I was going to make them pay, I needed to stay in control. As I drove, memories of the past 9 years flooded my mind. Our wedding day, the joy on Melissa's face as we exchanged vows, the countless nights spent with Eric, sharing drinks, laughing about old times, and supporting each other through life's challenges. How could everything have been a lie? How could they have betrayed me so completely for so long? The pain was unbearable, a deep, gnawing ache in my chest that threatened to consume me. But with every wave of anguish, another feeling began to rise within me, something darker, colder, more dangerous. It was the spark of a fire that had the potential to burn everything to the ground, and I welcomed it. I let the anger wash over me, stealing my resolve. They had taken everything from me, and now it was my turn. I found myself driving aimlessly, needing time and space to process what I had seen. I ended up at a small, quiet park on the outskirts of town. It was a place I used to visit when I needed to think, and today I needed it more than ever. I parked the car and sat on a bench under a large oak tree, staring blankly at the playground in front of me. The more I thought about it, the more everything began to fall into place. The late-night meetings Eric had, the way Melissa had grown distant over the years, the subtle changes in their behavior around each other. How could I have been so blind? How had I missed the signs? But it didn't matter now. What mattered was what I was going to do next. I knew confronting them directly wouldn't be enough. They would apologize, make excuses, try to justify their actions, but it would never be enough to heal the wound they had inflicted on me. No, I needed to hurt them in a way that they would never forget. I needed to take away everything they held dear, just as they had done to me. As I sat there, the plan began to take shape in my mind. It would take time, patience, and careful execution, but I was ready. Every moment of their betrayal had been a knife in my back, and now I was going to twist that knife and make them feel every ounce of pain they had caused me. I knew the road ahead would be long and treacherous, but I didn't care. I had nothing left to lose. Melissa and Eric had seen to that. The love I once had for them had turned to ash, replaced by a burning desire for revenge. And so, I sat there, in the quiet of the park, with only my thoughts for company, as the fire within me grew stronger. They wouldn't see it coming, not from me. They had always underestimated me, thought of me as the kind of man who could be easily manipulated, easily deceived. But they were wrong. They had no idea what I was capable of when pushed to the edge, and I was ready to show them. I left the park with a new sense of purpose, the pain still there, but now a source of strength rather than weakness. The game was still in play, and I was ready to make my next move. They had taken the first step by betraying me, but the final move, that would be mine. The days that followed were a blur, a haze of anger barely kept in check by a growing sense of determination. I kept my distance from Melissa, avoiding confrontations and playing the role of the oblivious husband. I couldn't afford to tip my hand just yet. Every morning I kissed her goodbye as if nothing had changed, while every night I lay awake, my mind racing with plans of retribution. But before I could strike, I needed to be sure of every detail. I needed to know exactly how deep the betrayal ran, how long it had been going on, and just how far they had taken it. My mind was filled with questions that needed answers, and I was willing to dig through every painful detail to find them. I started with the basics, combing through Melissa's phone records, emails, and social media accounts. It didn't take long to uncover the truth. Hidden in plain sight were the signs I had missed: texts from Eric at odd hours, sudden changes in plans that coincided with his messages, and secretive emails exchanged under the guise of work. As I pieced together the timeline, I realized that the affair had been going on for nearly our entire marriage. 9 years. 9 long years of lies and deception. The knowledge was a punch to the gut, but I forced myself to keep going. I began looking through old photos, digging out the ones from vacations, parties, and gatherings where Eric had been present. I scrutinized every image, every interaction, searching for any hint that might have escaped my notice at the time. And there it was. The way they looked at each other when they thought I wasn't paying attention, the casual touches that were anything but innocent, the inside jokes that left me on the outside. It was all there, hidden in plain sight. My investigation didn't stop with just their digital footprints. I started visiting the places they frequented together: restaurants, coffee shops, and even hotels. I spoke to people who knew them, pretending to be an unaware husband who just wanted to surprise his wife. Some of them offered small hints, little comments about how close Melissa and Eric seemed, or how often they were seen together when I wasn't around. Each piece of information was another nail in the coffin of my old life. The hardest part was pretending that everything was normal when I was around them. Every time Melissa smiled at me, every time Eric made a joke, it took everything in me not to lash out. But I had to be patient. They couldn't know that I was onto them, not yet. In the midst of my investigation, I found myself haunted by the memories of our early days together. Melissa's laughter, Eric's loyalty, the bond we had shared. How had everything gone so wrong? I wanted to hate them completely, to let my anger consume every trace of love I had once felt for them. But the truth was, beneath the fury, there was still a part of me that was devastated, that mourned the loss of the life I thought I had. But I couldn't afford to dwell on that. Not now. I had a plan to execute, and the time for mourning was over. Armed with the truth, I was ready to take the next step. Every piece of evidence I had gathered, every painful revelation, would serve as a weapon in my arsenal. I would use it to tear down the facade they had built and expose them for the liars they were. As I compiled everything I had found, I began to feel a twisted sense of satisfaction. For so long they had deceived me, believing that I was none the wiser. But now, the tables had turned. I held all the cards, and it was only a matter of time before I played my hand. They had thought they could keep their secret hidden forever, but they had underestimated me. They had no idea what I was capable of when driven by a thirst for revenge. And soon they would learn that the truth, once uncovered, was far more destructive than any lie. With every piece of the puzzle in place, I was ready to begin the first phase of my plan. But to pull it off, I had to maintain the charade that nothing had changed. I had to convince Melissa and Eric that their secret was still safe, that I was still the trusting husband and best friend they believed me to be. It wasn't easy, but the thought of what was to come gave me the strength to keep up the act. I started with Melissa. I knew her well enough to understand how to manipulate her, how to play on her emotions. I became the attentive husband she had always claimed to want, the one who listened to her every word and indulged her every whim. I showered her with affection, took her out on spontaneous dates, and made her feel like she was the center of my world. She was caught off guard at first, surprised by my sudden change in behavior. But soon enough, she relaxed into it, her guilt easing as she convinced herself that things were finally improving between us. But while I was pouring on the charm, I was also tightening my grip on her life. I quietly began to take control of our finances, moving funds into accounts that only I had access to. Melissa, blissfully unaware, continued spending as usual, never realizing that the safety net she believed she had was slowly being pulled out from under her. At the same time, I kept up appearances with Eric. It was harder, pretending that nothing was wrong when every fiber of my being wanted to confront him, to beat the smug look off his face. But I forced myself to smile, to laugh at his jokes, and to act like the same old Jason he thought he knew. I invited him over for drinks just like we used to, and listened as he talked about work, sports, and the mundane details of his life. All the while, I was gathering information, finding ways to subtly undermine him without raising suspicion. The first major blow came when I learned about an upcoming promotion Eric was in line for. It was a significant step up, one that would give him more power and influence at his company. But I couldn't let that happen. Using the information I had gathered, I anonymously sent a tip to his superiors, outlining discrepancies in his work and hinting at unethical behavior. It was just enough to plant doubt in their minds, to make them reconsider their decision. When Eric found out he'd been passed over for the promotion, he was livid, unable to understand what had gone wrong. I watched with silent satisfaction as the stress began to take its toll on him. He became irritable, short-tempered, and less attentive to Melissa, who in turn grew more distant and frustrated. The cracks in their relationship began to show, and I reveled in every moment of their growing discord. But I didn't stop there. I started planting seeds of doubt in Melissa's mind as well. Small, subtle comments about Eric, questions that made her second-guess his intentions, his loyalty. I knew her insecurities, knew how to exploit them. It wasn't long before she started to wonder if Eric was really as devoted to her as she had believed, or if he was just using her for his own gain. The tension between them continued to build, and I watched it all unfold with a cold, calculated detachment. This was just the beginning, the first phase of a plan that would see them both brought to their knees. I knew it would take time, that I would need to be patient, but I was in no rush. The more they suffered, the sweeter my revenge would be. In the meantime, I kept up my role as the loving husband, ensuring that Melissa never suspected a thing. Every day, I played my part with precision, a smile on my face and venom in my heart. They had underestimated me, but they wouldn't make that mistake again. I was always one step ahead, carefully orchestrating their downfall while they remained oblivious. As the days turned into weeks, I could see the strain beginning to show. Melissa and Eric were no longer the confident, carefree lovers they had once been. Their secret meetings became less frequent, their conversations more strained. The guilt and doubt I had sown were beginning to take root, slowly eroding the foundation of their relationship. But I wasn't done yet. This was only the beginning. The real destruction was still to come, and when it did, it would be swift, brutal, and utterly devastating. They would never see it coming, and by the time they realized what was happening, it would be too late. For now, I would continue to play the long game, biding my time and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The pieces were in place, and the stage was set. All that remained was to pull the strings and watch as their world crumbled around them. As Melissa basked in the false security of our renewed affection, and Eric continued to stumble under the weight of his failed promotion, I turned my focus to the next step in my plan. The financial manipulation was crucial. If I could undermine Melissa's security and independence, it would add a layer of vulnerability that I could exploit to my advantage. It started with small, almost imperceptible changes. I began by discreetly transferring funds from our joint accounts into a private account that I had opened in my name alone. Each transfer was carefully calculated to avoid raising suspicion, just enough to make a difference, but not so much that Melissa would notice immediately. I ensured that our bills and essential expenses were still covered, maintaining the facade of a responsible husband. Over time, the small withdrawals added up. I made sure to keep detailed records of every transaction, ensuring that nothing could be traced back to me. I was meticulous in my planning, knowing that any slip-up could reveal my intentions. As the weeks passed, I started to notice the effects of my financial maneuvers. Melissa became increasingly concerned about our budget, scrutinizing every expense more closely than usual. She started asking questions about our savings and investment accounts, questions that I answered with a practiced calmness, carefully deflecting any deeper inquiry. I began to subtly limit her access to funds, making it more difficult for her to make large purchases or plan for any unexpected expenses. Whenever she needed to make a significant transaction, I was there to approve it, creating a facade of cooperation while keeping tight control over our finances. Melissa seemed to grow more anxious with each passing day, her comfort and confidence eroding under the pressure of financial uncertainty. Meanwhile, I was setting up the next phase of my plan. I knew that the true impact of my actions would only become apparent when Melissa attempted to use our funds for something crucial, a family emergency, a large purchase, or even just a planned vacation. By then, she would discover that the money she believed was available to her had been siphoned off, leaving her scrambling for answers. The day came sooner than I expected. Melissa called me at work, her voice tinged with stress. She had discovered an issue with our credit card and needed immediate clarification. I played the concerned husband, pretending to be surprised by the problem. In reality, I knew exactly what had happened. My recent transfers had left our account in a precarious state, and the credit card company had flagged it for suspicious activity. When Melissa asked for a detailed explanation of our financial situation, I carefully maneuvered the conversation. I pretended to be open and transparent, offering to sit down with her that evening to go over everything. It was a delicate balance. While I wanted her to be concerned, I didn't want her to become too suspicious or confrontational. That night, as we sat at the kitchen table, I presented her with a carefully crafted explanation. I highlighted the recent expenses and explained how they had affected our overall budget. I used vague terms and complex jargon to obfuscate the reality of the situation, making it seem like a temporary setback rather than a deliberate sabotage. Melissa, though clearly distressed, accepted my explanations, though the worry in her eyes didn't completely disappear. As days turned into weeks, the financial strain began to take its toll on Melissa. Her stress levels increased, and she began to withdraw from our relationship, focusing more on trying to fix our finances than on maintaining our connection. The once happy wife who had embraced our renewed closeness was now a shadow of her former self, her anxiety about money overshadowing everything else. I watched the unfolding drama with a mixture of satisfaction and detachment. The financial trap I had set was working perfectly, adding pressure to Melissa's life and pushing her further into a corner. She was beginning to question her own stability, and as her financial independence eroded, so too did her confidence in controlling her life. The cracks in her armor were widening, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the full impact of my actions would come crashing down on her. The plan was moving forward, just as I had hoped. The final phases were still ahead, but every step I took was carefully calculated to ensure that when the time came, the fallout would be total and devastating. For now, I continued to play my part as the supportive husband, concealing the glee I felt at each new sign of Melissa's growing distress. The stage was set, and the pieces were falling into place. The endgame was still to come, but the groundwork was solid, and my revenge was taking shape with every passing day. With Melissa trapped in the web of financial uncertainty I had spun, I turned my attention back to Eric. The groundwork had been laid. The seeds of doubt and insecurity were already planted in both of their minds. Now it was time to escalate the tension between them, driving a wedge so deep that it would be impossible for their relationship to survive. The first step was subtle. I began to distance myself from Eric, just enough to make him notice, but not enough to raise immediate alarm. I stopped initiating contact, making him the one to reach out to me. When he did, I was always just a little too busy, too distracted, offering vague excuses about work or family obligations. I knew this would create a sense of unease in him, a nagging suspicion that something was off. At the same time, I continued to fuel Melissa's doubts about Eric. I would casually mention conversations I'd had with him, carefully selecting details that could be misconstrued or that might trigger her insecurities. I brought up old stories about his past relationships, emphasizing his tendency to be unfaithful or unreliable. I did it all with an air of concern, as if I was just looking out for her, planting the idea that maybe, just maybe, Eric wasn't as trustworthy as she thought. The real turning point came when I began to manipulate their communication. I had already gained access to Melissa's phone and emails during my initial investigation, and now I used that access to send anonymous messages to both of them. To Melissa, I sent vague, cryptic messages that hinted at Eric's unfaithfulness, suggesting that he might be seeing someone else behind her back. To Eric, I sent similar messages, implying that Melissa was growing tired of him, that she might be rekindling her feelings for me. I made sure to send these messages at the most opportune times, late at night when they were already feeling vulnerable, or during moments of stress when their tempers were short. Each message was crafted to play on their deepest fears and insecurities, to make them question not just each other but themselves. The effect was immediate. Melissa grew more withdrawn, her interactions with Eric becoming colder and more distant. She started avoiding him, making excuses to spend less time together. When they did meet, their conversations were strained, laced with tension and suspicion. Eric, for his part, became increasingly paranoid, his usual confidence eroded by the nagging fear that Melissa was hiding something from him. I watched from the sidelines as their relationship began to unravel. The trust that had once bound them together was crumbling, replaced by doubt, jealousy, and anger. They started arguing more frequently, small disagreements escalating into full-blown fights. Their secret meetings became less passionate and more confrontational, each encounter leaving them more frustrated and disconnected. To further isolate them, I subtly encouraged Melissa to reconnect with old friends, suggesting that she needed a break from everything that was weighing on her. I knew that her friends would offer a different perspective, one that would likely amplify her doubts about Eric. I made sure to steer her toward the friends who were more critical of him, those who had never fully approved of their relationship. As expected, they began to fill her head with warnings and advice, urging her to reconsider her choices. Eric, on the other hand, found himself increasingly alone. With Melissa pulling away and me no longer available as his confidant, he had no one to turn to. His frustration grew, and in his desperation to hold on to what he had with Melissa, he became more possessive, more demanding, further pushing her away. The wedge I had driven between them was widening with every passing day. They had once believed that their affair made them invincible, that they could defy the odds and be together without consequence. But now, they were learning that their relationship had been built on a foundation of lies and betrayal, and that foundation was beginning to crack. I continued to stoke the flames, carefully monitoring their interactions and adjusting my tactics as needed. I would drop hints here and there, say just enough to keep them both on edge without ever revealing my hand. The beauty of it all was that they never suspected me. They were too caught up in their own drama, too consumed by their own guilt and fear, to realize that I was the one pulling the strings. The closer they came to breaking, the more satisfaction I felt. This was what they deserved: the pain, the doubt, the fear. They had betrayed me for years, and now they were paying the price. And the best part? The final blow hadn't even been delivered yet. I was saving that for when they were at their weakest, when they had nothing left to hold on to. For now, I would let them twist in the wind, struggling to keep their crumbling relationship from falling apart. The end was near, and when it came, it would be swift, brutal, and inescapable. They had no idea what was coming, but I did, and I couldn't wait to watch it all unfold. The tension between Melissa and Eric had reached a boiling point. Their once secretive affair, once thrilling and full of passion, had become a source of endless stress and conflict. Every conversation they had was laced with suspicion, every glance filled with doubt. The facade they had built was crumbling, and neither of them knew how to stop it. I knew it was time to take the next step. The moment had come to shatter their illusions once and for all, to force them to confront the reality of their actions. But this confrontation wouldn't be accidental. I would orchestrate it, ensuring that it would be as painful and devastating as possible. It started with a simple message. I used a burner phone to send an anonymous text to Eric, a message that would lead him straight into my trap. It was a carefully crafted note, just vague enough to spark his curiosity, but specific enough to make him think he was about to uncover something significant. I told him to meet at a certain location, promising that he would find the answers he had been desperately seeking about Melissa. Simultaneously, I sent a message to Melissa, using the same tactic. I hinted that she needed to be at the same place, suggesting that it was crucial for her to be there if she wanted to understand what was really going on with Eric. I knew that her curiosity, coupled with her growing distrust of him, would compel her to show up. The location I chose was a small, secluded park on the outskirts of town, a place where they would be unlikely to run into anyone they knew. It was perfect for what I had in mind, a place where they could confront each other in private, away from prying eyes, and where I could watch the whole thing unfold without being seen. The day of the confrontation, I arrived at the park early, positioning myself in a spot where I could observe without being noticed. I felt a strange mix of anticipation and cold detachment as I waited for them to arrive. This was the moment I had been planning for, the moment when all my efforts would finally pay off. Melissa arrived first, her face tense with anxiety. She looked around nervously, her hands fidgeting as she waited, clearly unsure of what to expect. Not long after, Eric appeared, his expression a mixture of anger and confusion. As soon as he saw her, I could see the questions forming in his mind, the doubts and fears that had been festering for weeks. They approached each other cautiously, neither of them speaking at first. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the weight of everything they had left unsaid. Finally, Eric broke the silence, his voice sharp with accusation. "Why are you here, Melissa?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing as he stared at her. "What's going on? Are you meeting someone else?" Melissa's eyes widened in shock at his words, her voice trembling as she replied, "What are you talking about, Eric? I got a message saying I needed to be here. I thought it was about you." Their argument escalated quickly. The tension that had been building for weeks finally erupted, spilling out in a torrent of accusations and denials. Eric accused Melissa of betraying him, of keeping secrets and lying to him. Melissa, in turn, lashed out at him, accusing him of being paranoid and controlling, of ruining what they had by not trusting her. As they argued, I could see the realization dawning on both of them. They had been set up, manipulated into this confrontation, but neither of them knew by whom. Their anger and confusion only grew as they began to grasp the full extent of their situation. Finally, Eric snapped. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, scrolling through the messages he had received. "I've been getting these texts for weeks now, Melissa. Someone's been trying to tell me that you're not who I thought you were, that you've been playing me." Melissa's face paled as she stared at the phone, recognizing the messages for what they were. She stammered, trying to find the words to defend herself, but the damage was already done. The trust between them was completely shattered, replaced by a deep, irreparable rift. As they stood there, their relationship in tatters, I felt a cold satisfaction. This was what they deserved. This pain, this betrayal, this realization that their actions had consequences. They had built their relationship on lies and deceit, and now those lies had come back to destroy them. But I wasn't done yet. I stepped out from my hiding place, revealing myself to them for the first time. The look of shock and horror on their faces as they saw me was everything I had hoped for. They had never expected me to be behind all of this, to be the one who had orchestrated their downfall. "Surprised to see me?" I said, my voice calm and steady. "You shouldn't be. You both thought you could play me for a fool, that I'd never find out. But I've known for a long time, and now you're going to pay for everything you've done." The reality of their situation hit them like a ton of bricks. Melissa's eyes filled with tears as she realized the full extent of my betrayal, while Eric's face twisted with a mix of guilt and anger. They had no defense, no way to justify what they had done, and they knew it. "I trusted you," I continued, my voice growing colder. "I trusted both of you. And this is how you repaid me? By lying, by cheating, by betraying everything we had? You thought you could get away with it, but you were wrong. I've been one step ahead of you this whole time, and now it's over. Everything you've built, everything you've done, it's all coming crashing down." They were speechless, paralyzed by the gravity of the situation. I could see the despair in their eyes, the realization that they had lost everything. And it was all because of me, because of the revenge I had so carefully planned and executed. I left them there, standing in the park, their world in ruins. The confrontation had gone exactly as I had hoped, and now the final phase of my plan could begin. They had thought they could deceive me, but they had only deceived themselves. And soon, they would realize just how deep my vengeance ran. After the confrontation in the park, everything began to unravel at an accelerated pace. The shock of my revelation left Melissa and Eric reeling, but the real destruction was only just beginning. I had meticulously planned each step, and now it was time to watch as the consequences of their actions tore their lives apart. Melissa was the first to break. The realization of what she had done, combined with the weight of my betrayal, shattered her. She tried to reach out to me, calling and texting incessantly, desperate to explain, to apologize, to somehow fix the unfixable. But I ignored her. Every message she sent went unanswered. Every call went to voicemail. I wanted her to feel the isolation, the helplessness, the crushing realization that there was no way out. Her desperation quickly turned to panic. Without access to our finances, she was left scrambling to cover the basics. The credit cards were maxed out, and the joint accounts were practically empty. Everything she had relied on was gone, and there was no one left to bail her out. The lifestyle she had enjoyed, funded by our shared income, was slipping through her fingers. She had to sell her expensive clothes and jewelry just to keep up with the bills, and even that wasn't enough. Meanwhile, word of the affair began to spread through our social circle. I made sure of that. I carefully leaked details to mutual friends, knowing that gossip would do the rest. The whispers started slowly at first, but soon enough everyone knew. The scandal was the talk of the town, and Melissa found herself ostracized, her once respected reputation in shambles. Invitations to events dried up, friends stopped returning her calls, and she was left to face the consequences of her actions alone. Eric didn't fare much better. His professional life took a hit after I sabotaged his promotion, and the added stress of the fallout from the affair only made things worse. His co-workers began to distance themselves from him, and his superiors lost confidence in his ability to lead. The rumors about his relationship with Melissa spread beyond our social circle, reaching his workplace, and it wasn't long before his superiors started questioning his judgment and integrity. At home, things were even worse. Eric had been married before the affair began, and now his wife, Caroline, had discovered everything. I made sure she knew the full extent of his betrayal, sending her a detailed dossier of evidence, text messages, photos, and even recordings. There was no way for Eric to deny it, no way to talk his way out of the truth. Caroline, humiliated and furious, filed for divorce immediately, taking the kids with her and leaving Eric with nothing but his guilt. As their lives crumbled, I watched from a distance, satisfied with the chaos I had created. They had underestimated me, thought they could betray me without consequence, and now they were paying the price. But my satisfaction was tempered by a strange emptiness. The revenge I had so carefully planned and executed had given me what I wanted, justice, retribution, but it hadn't brought me peace. Instead, it left a void, a hollow space where my love and trust had once been. I spent my days in a sort of numb detachment, going through the motions of work and life without any real purpose. The anger that had driven me was gone, replaced by a dull ache that I couldn't shake. I had won, but the victory felt meaningless. I had destroyed their lives, but in the process, I had lost something vital in myself. One evening, as I sat alone in the quiet of my home, I found myself scrolling through old photos, images of happier times, of Melissa and me, of our friends, of Eric before everything went wrong. It was strange to see those moments frozen in time, knowing now what I didn't know then. There had been real happiness once, real connections, and I had torn them all apart. I wasn't sure if it was worth it anymore, but there was no going back. I had made my choices, and now I had to live with them. The fallout from the confrontation had left Melissa and Eric in ruins, and I knew that they would never recover, not fully. The wounds were too deep, the betrayals too profound. They would carry the scars of this for the rest of their lives, as would I. As I put the photos away, I realized that the final phase of my plan was complete. There was nothing left to do, nothing left to destroy. I had achieved my revenge, but at what cost? I wasn't sure anymore. All I knew was that I was alone now, truly alone, and that perhaps in the end, the price of vengeance was too high. The days following the fallout were a blur of emptiness. With nothing left to plan, no more moves to make, I found myself adrift in a sea of my own making. The revenge I had so meticulously crafted had consumed every part of me, leaving behind a void that I didn't know how to fill. Melissa had stopped trying to contact me. Her attempts to reach out dwindled as the reality of her situation set in. She must have realized there was no redemption, no path back to what we had before. I imagined her in the silence of our old home, surrounded by the remnants of a life she had destroyed with her own hands. The thought brought me no satisfaction, only a cold, distant awareness that this was what she deserved. Eric, too, had faded into the background. After Caroline's departure, he became a ghost in our once shared world. He left his job, unable to face the shame and the whispers that followed him wherever he went. I heard through the grapevine that he had moved out of town, seeking a fresh start where no one knew his name or his past. But there was no running from what he had done. The weight of his actions would follow him wherever he went. And me? I was left with the silence. The quiet was oppressive, filling every corner of my life with a profound sense of loss. The house, once filled with laughter, arguments, and the mundane noise of daily life, was now a mausoleum of memories. I wandered through it like a ghost myself, touching the walls, the furniture, the pictures that still hung on the walls as if by some cruel joke. Every object reminded me of what had been and what could never be again. At night, the silence was even louder. Sleep became elusive, my mind replaying the events of the past months over and over again, searching for some meaning, some justification that would make it all worth it. But there was none. The anger that had fueled me, the sense of betrayal that had driven every action, had dissipated, leaving behind only a deep, abiding sorrow. I took to spending hours in my study, the one room that still felt like mine. I would sit at my desk, staring at the walls, lost in thought. Sometimes I would reach for a book, hoping to lose myself in someone else's story, but the words never stuck. My mind was too full of my own story, one that had no satisfying conclusion. It was during one of these long nights in the stillness of the early morning hours that I began to write. At first, it was just disjointed thoughts, fragments of ideas that I needed to get out of my head. But as the words flowed, I found myself telling the story, the whole story, from the beginning, before the betrayal, through every twist and turn of my plan, and finally, to the bitter end. Writing became my way of processing everything that had happened. It was the only thing that made sense in the chaos of my mind. I poured every emotion, every regret, every fleeting moment of satisfaction onto the page, hoping that somehow it would bring me clarity. Maybe it would help me understand why I had done what I did, or maybe it would just be a way to exorcise the ghosts that haunted me. As the days turned into weeks, the pages piled up. The story took shape, not as a confession, but as a chronicle of what revenge had cost me. It was raw and unflinching, a brutal look at the man I had become in the pursuit of justice. There were moments of triumph, sure, but they were overshadowed by the profound sense of loss that permeated every word. When I finished the last page, I sat back in my chair, exhausted, but somehow lighter. The silence was still there, but it no longer felt as oppressive. I had faced the truth of what I had done, and in doing so, I had begun to accept it. There was no going back, no undoing the damage, but there was a strange peace in knowing that I had told my story, if only to myself. I didn't know what to do with the manuscript. It wasn't meant for anyone else, not really. It was too personal, too raw to share with the world. But it was mine, a testament to the journey I had taken, a reminder of the price I had paid. I placed it in a drawer, locking it away with the other remnants of my old life. Maybe one day I would revisit it, but for now it was enough to know that it existed. The days continued to pass, each one blending into the next. The silence remained, but it was no longer my enemy. It was simply a part of my new reality, one that I was learning to live with. The world outside moved on, oblivious to the battles that had been fought and the lives that had been torn apart. And I too would move on, though perhaps not in the way I had once imagined. For now, I would live with the choices I had made, the silence my constant companion. And maybe in time, I would find a way to fill the void that revenge had left behind. But for now, it was enough to know that I had survived it. The months that followed were a slow, painful process of coming to terms with my new reality. The revenge I had sought had consumed every part of me, leaving behind a barren landscape of emotions. But life, indifferent to my inner turmoil, continued on. I had to find a way to exist in the aftermath, to navigate the emptiness that had become my daily existence. It was during one of my aimless walks through the city, in a rare moment of clarity, that I realized I couldn't continue like this. The silence, once so suffocating, was no longer enough to drown out the voice in my head that kept asking, "What now?" I had been living in a state of suspended animation, trapped in the past, but now that past was no longer an anchor. It was a weight I couldn't carry forever. One day, on a whim, I visited a local bookstore, one I had passed by countless times but never entered. It was a small, cozy place, with shelves packed tightly together, the smell of old paper and ink hanging in the air. The owner, an older man with a warm smile and a quiet demeanor, nodded to me as I entered. I returned the nod and began to browse aimlessly. As I walked through the aisles, running my fingers along the spines of the books, I found myself drawn to the self-help section. It was ironic given my usual disdain for the genre, but something in me was searching for answers, for guidance on how to rebuild. I picked up a book on healing after betrayal and found a quiet corner to sit and read. The words on the page resonated with me more than I had expected. The author spoke about the pain of betrayal, the consuming anger that often followed, and the long, difficult journey to forgiveness, not just of others, but of oneself. It was as if the book had been written for me, capturing my experience in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. I visited the bookstore more frequently after that, sometimes to read, sometimes just to be around others without having to engage. The owner, whose name I learned was Harold, began to strike up conversations with me. They started as simple exchanges about books, but over time, we delved into deeper topics: life, loss, and the struggle to find meaning in the face of overwhelming pain. Harold had lived through his own share of hardships, though he never spoke of them in detail. But there was a quiet wisdom in his words, a sense that he understood what it meant to suffer and to heal. He never pried into my life, never asked for details, but he offered something I hadn't realized I needed: connection. It was a small thing, these conversations, but they began to fill the void in a way that the silence never could. One day, after months of these visits, Harold mentioned a local support group that met once a week in the back room of the bookstore. It was a group for people who had experienced betrayal, a place to share stories and find support among others who had walked the same painful path. He suggested that I might find it helpful, though he made it clear there was no pressure. At first, the idea of sharing my story with strangers seemed impossible. I had locked my pain away so tightly, buried it under layers of anger and regret, that the thought of exposing it felt unbearable. But Harold's gentle suggestion lingered in my mind, and eventually, curiosity got the better of me. The night I decided to attend the group, I arrived early, my nerves frayed. The back room of the bookstore was small and dimly lit, with a circle of chairs set up in the center. A few people were already seated, speaking quietly among themselves. They looked up as I entered, offering polite, if somewhat wary, smiles. The facilitator, a woman named Karen, welcomed me with a warmth that immediately put me at ease. She explained that the group was a safe space, where everyone was free to share as much or as little as they wanted. There was no judgment, only support. I nodded, though my throat was tight with anxiety. As the meeting began, the others shared their stories, tales of betrayal by spouses, friends, even family members. Each story was unique, but the underlying pain was the same. It was strange to hear my own feelings reflected in their words, the same anger, the same sense of loss, the same struggle to find a way forward. When it was my turn to speak, I hesitated, the weight of my story pressing down on me. But as I looked around the room, at the faces of those who had shared their own pain, I felt something shift inside me. The walls I had built around myself, the defenses I had relied on, began to crack. I started talking, haltingly at first, then with growing confidence. I told them about the betrayal, the years of deceit, the revenge I had orchestrated, and the emptiness that had followed. I didn't spare myself in the telling, laying bare the ugliness of what I had done, the satisfaction that had quickly turned to regret. As I spoke, I could feel the weight lifting, the burden of my story no longer mine alone to carry. The others listened without interruption, their expressions full of understanding and empathy. When I finished, there was a moment of silence, and then Karen spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Thank you for sharing that," she said. "It takes a lot of courage to face what you've been through, and even more to acknowledge the ways it's changed you. But you're here, and that's the first step toward healing." The others nodded in agreement, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel alone. The sense of isolation that had haunted me for months began to fade, replaced by a tentative hope that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way forward. The support group became a regular part of my life. Each week I returned, sometimes to share, sometimes just to listen. The connections I made there, the stories I heard, helped me to slowly rebuild the parts of myself that revenge had shattered. It wasn't easy, and there were setbacks along the way, but the progress was real. Harold noticed the change in me, though he never commented on it directly. Our conversations became more relaxed, more open, and I found myself looking forward to my visits to the bookstore, not just for the books, but for the sense of community that had begun to take root in my life. The pain of what had happened, of what I had done, would never fully disappear. But I was learning to live with it, to accept it as a part of my story, without letting it define me. The silence that had once been my only refuge was now just a quiet space between the moments of connection, a reminder of how far I had come. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time I felt like I was walking it with purpose. The glimmer of redemption was faint, but it was there, guiding me forward, and that, for now, was enough. As the months passed, I began to settle into a new rhythm, one that no longer revolved around the darkness of my past. The support group became a constant in my life, a place where I could be honest about my struggles and where I found a sense of belonging that I hadn't felt in a long time. But it wasn't just the group that helped me move forward. It was also the friendship that unexpectedly blossomed with Harold. It started simply enough. After each support group meeting, I would linger in the bookstore, browsing through the shelves, sometimes buying a book or two. Harold, with his easygoing nature, would join me, offering recommendations or just making small talk. Over time, our conversations grew deeper, touching on topics far beyond books. Harold was a man of few words, but what he said always carried weight. He had an air of quiet wisdom, the kind that comes from years of life experience. He never pried into my past, but I sensed that he understood more than he let on. There was a calmness about him, a steadiness that I found both comforting and intriguing. One evening, after a particularly difficult support group session, I found myself sitting at a small table in the corner of the bookstore, lost in thought. Harold noticed and brought over 2 cups of coffee, sitting down across from me without a word. We sat in silence for a while, the warmth of the coffee between us, before he finally spoke. "You're carrying a heavy burden, aren't you?" he said, his voice gentle. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Harold didn't push for more. He just sat there, his presence a quiet reassurance. After a long pause, I finally found my voice. "I thought revenge would make me feel better," I admitted. "But all it did was leave me empty." Harold nodded, as if he had expected this. "Revenge is like that," he said. "It gives the illusion of satisfaction, but it rarely brings the peace we're looking for. You can destroy someone else's life, but in the process, you often destroy a part of yourself too." His words struck a chord with me. That was exactly how I felt, like I had lost a part of myself in the pursuit of revenge. The anger and hurt had driven me to do things I never thought I was capable of, and now, in the aftermath, I was left with the pieces of a life that no longer made sense. "I don't know how to move on from this," I confessed, the weight of my emotions pressing down on me. "I've lost everything. My marriage, my friendships, even my sense of who I am." Harold leaned back in his chair, studying me with a thoughtful expression. "You haven't lost everything," he said quietly. "You still have yourself. And as long as you have that, you have the potential to rebuild." His words lingered in the air between us, and I found myself pondering them long after I left the bookstore that night. Harold was right. I still had myself, even if that self was battered and bruised. The question was, what did I want to do with what was left? Over the next few weeks, Harold and I continued to talk, our conversations becoming a regular part of my routine. We discussed everything from the books we were reading to the challenges of moving forward after betrayal. Harold shared some of his own experiences, revealing bits and pieces of a past that had clearly shaped him into the man he was today. It turned out that Harold had once been a different man, one who had let bitterness and anger consume him after a betrayal of his own. He didn't go into details, but I could see the echoes of that pain in his eyes, even after all these years. He told me how he had eventually found his way out of that darkness, not through revenge or denial, but through acceptance and forgiveness, both of himself and of the person who had wronged him. His story resonated with me in a way I hadn't expected. It gave me hope that maybe, just maybe, I could find my way out of the darkness too. Harold never offered me easy answers, but he showed me that it was possible to heal, even from the deepest wounds. It was a slow process, one that required patience and a willingness to confront the pain head-on, but it was possible. One day, as we were talking over coffee, Harold said something that stuck with me. "Healing isn't about forgetting," he said. "It's about learning to live with the memories in a way that doesn't define you. You can't change the past, but you can choose how you carry it with you into the future." Those words became a kind of mantra for me. I began to think about what it would mean to carry my past in a way that didn't weigh me down. It wasn't about pretending the pain didn't exist, or about excusing the actions of those who had hurt me. It was about finding a way to integrate those experiences into the person I was becoming, to let them inform my growth rather than hinder it. With Harold's guidance, I started taking small steps toward rebuilding my life. I explored new interests, reconnected with distant family members, and began to envision a future that wasn't defined by the betrayal I had suffered. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of my past felt too heavy to bear. But there were also moments of light, of clarity, where I could see the possibility of a new beginning. Harold never claimed to have all the answers, but he gave me something far more valuable: his friendship. In him, I found a mentor of sorts, someone who had walked a similar path and had come out the other side stronger for it. His presence in my life was a reminder that healing was possible, that even in the darkest times, there could be hope. As the weeks turned into months, I realized that I was no longer just surviving. I was starting to live again. The pain of the past was still there, but it was no longer the center of my world. I was beginning to see that there was more to life than the hurt I had carried for so long, and that maybe, just maybe, I could find peace after all. Harold's friendship was the unexpected gift that had helped me take those first tentative steps toward healing. And though I knew the journey was far from over, I also knew that I wasn't walking it alone. For the first time in a long time, I felt like there was a future worth looking forward to. The idea of forgiveness had always felt foreign to me, a concept meant for the virtuous or the naive, but not for someone like me, someone who had been betrayed in the most personal, soul-crushing way. For so long, forgiveness seemed synonymous with weakness, with letting the people who had wronged me off the hook. It wasn't something I thought I could ever do, nor did I believe they deserved it. But as I continued to navigate the aftermath of my revenge, as I found solace in Harold's friendship and the support group's camaraderie, I began to see forgiveness in a different light. It wasn't about excusing Melissa or Eric for what they had done. It was about freeing myself from the chains that had bound me to the past. The idea nagged at me, slowly working its way into my thoughts until I couldn't ignore it any longer. It was Harold who first brought up the subject during one of our late-night conversations. We were sitting in the bookstore after hours, the soft glow of the table lamp casting long shadows across the room. The topic had been dancing around the edges of our talks for weeks, but this time, Harold approached it directly. "Have you thought about forgiveness?" he asked, his tone gentle but firm. I hesitated, the word hanging in the air between us like a challenge. "I don't know if I can," I finally admitted. "After everything they did, how can I forgive them? They don't deserve it." Harold nodded, as if he had expected my response. "Forgiveness isn't about them," he said. "It's about you. It's about letting go of the anger and the pain that's been consuming you. It's about finding peace within yourself, regardless of whether they ever seek it from you." His words struck me deeply. I had spent so much time fixated on what Melissa and Eric deserved that I had never considered what I needed. The anger I had harbored for so long had served its purpose in fueling my revenge, but now it was just a heavy burden, one that kept me tethered to the very people I wanted to escape. "What if I'm not ready?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "That's okay," Harold replied. "Forgiveness is a process, not a destination. It's something you work towards step by step at your own pace. The important thing is to start thinking about it, to open yourself up to the possibility." I sat with his words, turning them over in my mind. Could I really let go of the bitterness, the sense of betrayal that had defined my life for so long? It seemed impossible, yet there was a part of me that longed for the peace Harold described, a peace that I had never known. The days that followed were filled with an internal struggle as I grappled with the idea of forgiveness. I found myself revisiting the past, not with the same seething anger as before, but with a newfound perspective. I thought about the years of deceit, the lies, the pain they had caused me. But I also thought about the toll it had taken on me to hold on to that anger, to let it shape my every thought and action. It was exhausting, carrying that weight. And slowly, I began to see that forgiveness wasn't about condoning what Melissa and Eric had done, but about releasing myself from the prison I had built around my own heart. The walls I had constructed to protect myself had also trapped me, and the only way out was through forgiveness. One night, after another long and sleepless stretch, I made a decision. It wasn't grand or dramatic. There was no moment of clarity, no sudden epiphany. It was just a quiet acceptance that I couldn't keep living like this. I needed to let go. The next day, I sat down at my desk and began to write. This time, though, it wasn't a story of revenge or betrayal. It was a letter to Melissa. I didn't plan what I was going to say. I just let the words flow from my heart, raw and unfiltered. I told her about the pain she had caused me, the deep sense of betrayal that had shattered my world. I didn't hold back, but I also didn't lash out. I simply laid it all bare. Every emotion, every thought I had kept bottled up for so long. And then, I wrote the words I never thought I would write. "I forgive you." I sat there, staring at those 3 words, my heart pounding in my chest. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a surrender, but not in the way I had feared. It was a surrender to peace, to the possibility of moving on from the past that had held me captive for so long. I finished the letter, folding it neatly and placing it in an envelope. I wasn't sure if I would ever send it. Maybe it was just for me, a way to release the burden I had been carrying. But writing it was enough. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of lightness, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Over the next few days, I wrote more letters. One to Eric, one to myself, even one to the man I used to be before all of this began. Each letter was a step toward healing, a way to forgive not only those who had wronged me, but also myself for the choices I had made in response. I shared what I had done with Harold, and he smiled, a look of quiet pride in his eyes. "You're on your way," he said simply. "Keep going." Forgiveness wasn't an instant cure. It didn't erase the pain or the memories, but it began to change the way I held them. The anger that had once been so consuming started to fade, replaced by a sense of acceptance. The scars would always be there, but they no longer defined me. As I continued to work through my feelings, I realized that forgiveness wasn't just about Melissa and Eric. It was about forgiving myself for the way I had let the betrayal consume me, for the person I had become in my quest for revenge. It was about finding a way to move forward with compassion, not just for others, but for myself as well. I knew the journey wasn't over. Forgiveness was a path I would have to walk for the rest of my life, but I was no longer afraid of it. For the first time, I felt like I was walking towards something better, something that wasn't tainted by the bitterness of the past. And with each step, I could feel the shadows receding, making way for the possibility of a future where the pain no longer held power over me. It was a future I never thought I would have, but now, with forgiveness as my guide, it was one I was ready to embrace. Forgiveness had been the first real step toward healing, but it wasn't the last. It was one thing to forgive Melissa and Eric, to release the anger that had held me captive for so long, but it was another thing entirely to rebuild the pieces of my life that had been shattered. The question now was, who was I going to be in the aftermath of everything that had happened? I began to realize that much of my identity had been tied to the betrayal, to the anger and the hurt that had defined me for years. Without those emotions to anchor me, I felt unmoored, uncertain of who I was or what I wanted. It was both liberating and terrifying, this new sense of possibility. In those early days of my recovery, I threw myself into activities that had once brought me joy, but had been abandoned in the wake of the betrayal. I took long walks in the park, rediscovering the simple pleasure of nature. I started reading again, not just books about healing and forgiveness, but novels, biographies, anything that caught my interest. And I picked up a hobby I hadn't touched in years: photography. There had been a time when photography was my passion, a way to capture the world around me, to find beauty in the mundane. But after Melissa's affair came to light, I had stopped taking pictures, as if the world no longer held anything worth remembering. Now, with the weight of my past starting to lift, I found myself drawn back to the camera. At first, it was awkward, like meeting an old friend after years of silence. But as I began to shoot again, the familiar thrill returned. The way light could transform a scene, the satisfaction of capturing a fleeting moment in time. Photography became my therapy, a way to see the world, and myself, through a different lens. I spent hours wandering the city, camera in hand, capturing everything from bustling streets to quiet corners of the park. I found beauty in the most unexpected places: a cracked sidewalk, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, the expressions on strangers' faces as they went about their day. Each photo was a small step toward reclaiming the parts of myself I had lost. As my collection of photographs grew, I realized that I was no longer taking pictures just for myself. There was something about sharing these images, these glimpses of a world that was slowly coming back into focus for me, that felt important. It was as if, by showing others the beauty I was rediscovering, I could affirm my own journey toward healing. It was Harold, of course, who first suggested that I display my work. We were sitting in the bookstore, flipping through a stack of prints I had brought to show him, when he looked up at me with that familiar twinkle in his eye. "You know," he said, "these are really something. Have you thought about putting together an exhibit?" The idea caught me off guard. An exhibit? The thought of sharing my work with others on such a public scale was both thrilling and terrifying. But Harold's encouragement was hard to ignore, and the more I thought about it, the more the idea began to take hold. What would I even call it? I asked, trying to picture my photographs hanging in a gallery. Harold smiled. "How about Reclaiming Life?" The title resonated with me. That's what this journey had been about: reclaiming my life, piece by piece, finding joy and meaning in a world that had once felt barren. It wasn't just about the photographs. It was about the process, the act of seeing beauty in the world again, of moving forward despite the pain. With Harold's help, I began to plan the exhibit. It was a daunting task, but it gave me a sense of purpose, something to work toward that wasn't tied to the past. I reached out to a local gallery, one that was known for supporting emerging artists, and to my surprise, they were interested. They liked the story behind the work, the idea of using art as a means of healing. The months leading up to the exhibit were a whirlwind of activity. I selected my favorite photographs, printed them, framed them, and wrote the captions. Each image told a part of my story, not just of betrayal and pain, but of hope, of rediscovery, of finding beauty in a world that had once seemed devoid of it. As the opening night approached, I found myself filled with a mix of excitement and anxiety. This exhibit wasn't just about showing my photographs. It was about sharing my journey, exposing the most vulnerable parts of myself to the world. But I knew it was a necessary step, a way to close the chapter on my past and step into whatever the future held. The night of the exhibit, the gallery was filled with people, friends, strangers, even some familiar faces from the support group. Harold was there, of course, a quiet pillar of support as I navigated the evening. As I walked through the gallery, listening to people's reactions to the photographs, I felt a strange sense of calm. This was my story, and I was finally ready to tell it. One photograph in particular seemed to capture everyone's attention. It was a simple image of a single tree in the park, its branches reaching toward the sky, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun. The caption read, "Resilience." A woman, someone I didn't know, stood in front of it for a long time before turning to me. "This is beautiful," she said softly. "It feels so hopeful." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. "That's what I was going for," I replied. "It's about finding hope, even when it seems impossible." As the evening drew to a close, I stood in the gallery, surrounded by the images that represented my journey. The pain of the past was still there, but it no longer defined me. I had found a way to reclaim my life, to find meaning and beauty in a world that had once seemed so cruel. The exhibit was a success, but more importantly, it was a turning point. It marked the moment when I finally began to see myself not as a victim of betrayal, but as someone who had survived it, who had grown from it. The darkness that had once consumed me was now just a part of my story, a story that was still being written, one photograph at a time. As I left the gallery that night, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in years. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time I was okay with that. I had reclaimed my life, and with it, the freedom to create something new, something beautiful, and that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all. The exhibit had marked a turning point, a moment where I felt I had finally begun to move forward. But there was still one final piece of unfinished business lingering in the background, something that I knew I couldn't ignore forever. It was time to face Melissa and Eric. For months I had managed to avoid them, to keep them out of my thoughts as much as possible, but I knew that true closure would require confronting them one last time. I didn't need to see them to seek revenge. I had already gone down that path. This time, it was about closure. For myself, it was about reclaiming my power, about looking them in the eyes and letting them know that they no longer had control over my life, that I was finally free from the grip of their betrayal. It started with a letter, simple and to the point. I wrote to Melissa first, asking her to meet me at a small cafe we used to frequent when things were good between us. The choice of location was deliberate. It was a place filled with memories, but I wanted to reclaim it for myself, to make new memories that weren't tainted by the past. The day of the meeting arrived with a strange sense of calm. I wasn't nervous, just resolute. I had nothing to prove to her, nothing to gain from this meeting other than the peace of mind that came with closure. When I walked into the cafe, I immediately spotted Melissa sitting at a corner table, fidgeting with her coffee cup. She looked up as I approached, and for a moment we just stared at each other. It had been months since we had last spoken, and time had changed both of us. Melissa looked tired, worn down, as if the weight of her actions had finally caught up with her. I wondered if she'd been carrying her own burden of guilt, but I didn't feel any satisfaction in that. I was past the point of wanting her to suffer. "Thanks for meeting me," I said as I sat down. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think you would want to see me again." "I didn't," I admitted, "but there are things that need to be said." For a few moments we sat in silence, the weight of everything that had happened between us hanging in the air. Melissa was the first to break the silence. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling, "for everything. I know I can't undo the damage I've caused, but I need you to know that I'm sorry." I looked at her, searching for the right words. I had imagined this moment so many times, but now that it was here, I realized that what I needed to say was simpler than I had thought. "I forgive you," I said quietly. The words came out easier than I expected. "Not for you, but for me. I've been carrying this anger and hurt for so long, and I'm tired of it. I'm ready to move on." She blinked as if she hadn't expected that. "You forgive me?" "Yes," I replied. "But forgiveness doesn't mean things go back to the way they were. It just means I'm letting go of the past, for my own sake. I'm not doing this to absolve you or to make you feel better. I'm doing it because I need to move forward with my life." She nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but thank you." I didn't respond to that. Whether she deserved it or not was irrelevant. Forgiveness wasn't about her. It was about freeing myself from the chains of our past. We talked for a while longer, not about us or what had happened, but about practical matters, finalizing the divorce, dividing our assets, things that had been left unresolved. There was no animosity between us, just a shared understanding that this was the end of the road. When I left the cafe, I felt a strange sense of relief. The conversation hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. I had said what I needed to say, and now I could finally close that chapter of my life. The next step was Eric. Confronting him was going to be different, more challenging. Our friendship had been one of the most important relationships in my life, and his betrayal had cut deeply. But just as with Melissa, I knew that I needed to face him if I was going to truly move on. I reached out to him with a text, simple and to the point. "We need to talk." He agreed to meet at a quiet bar near his apartment, a place we used to go to after work. When I walked in, Eric was already there, nursing a drink. He looked up as I approached, and I could see the guilt written all over his face. For a moment I considered walking away, but I knew that would only prolong the inevitable. "Eric," I said as I sat down, "we need to clear the air." He nodded, his expression grim. "I know. I don't even know where to begin." "Start with the truth," I replied. "Why? Why did you do it?" He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. "I don't have a good answer for you," he admitted. "I was selfish. I wanted something that wasn't mine to take, and I didn't care about the consequences. I betrayed you, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life." I let his words sink in. There was no excuse, no justification that could ever make what he had done okay, but hearing him admit his guilt was a step toward closure. "I don't think I'll ever understand how you could do that to me," I said, my voice steady. "But I'm not here for an explanation. I'm here to tell you that I'm done letting what you and Melissa did control my life." He looked up, surprise flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I'm moving on," I said. "I'm not going to let this define me anymore. I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace. I've wasted enough time on anger and bitterness. It's time for me to let go." Eric looked stunned, as if he hadn't expected that. "You forgive me?" "Yes," I replied. "But that doesn't mean we go back to being friends. That part of my life is over. I'm ready to move on, and I need to do that without you in it." He nodded slowly, as if he had expected this, but was still processing the reality of it. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'm sorry for everything." I didn't need to hear his apology again, and I didn't need to dwell on the past any longer. This conversation was about closure, about putting an end to the pain and moving forward with my life. When I left the bar, I felt a sense of finality. The weight I had been carrying for so long had finally been lifted. Confronting Melissa and Eric hadn't been about revenge or making them suffer. It had been about reclaiming my life, about closing the door on the past and stepping into the future with a clean slate. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. The betrayal that had once defined me was now just a part of my story, a chapter that had come to an end. And as I walked away from the bar, I knew that I was ready to write the next chapter, one filled with hope, with possibility, and with a newfound sense of peace. In the aftermath of my meetings with Melissa and Eric, I found myself standing at the edge of a new beginning, the horizon clear and inviting. The process of letting go and forgiving had paved the way for a fresh start, but now it was up to me to shape this new chapter of my life. With the past finally behind me, I was ready to embrace the possibilities of the future. I decided to take a break from the city, to find a place where I could fully immerse myself in this sense of renewal. After some research, I settled on a small town nestled in the mountains, a place known for its natural beauty and tranquil atmosphere. It felt like the perfect setting to begin this next phase of my life, to reconnect with myself and explore what I truly wanted. The move was both exhilarating and daunting. I packed up the remnants of my old life, leaving behind the apartment that had been a constant reminder of the pain and betrayal. As I loaded the last box into the car, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of sadness and relief. It was the end of one chapter, but it was also the beginning of something new. Arriving in the small mountain town was like stepping into a different world. The air was crisp and fresh, the scenery breathtaking. The town itself was quaint, with charming shops and friendly locals. I found a cozy cottage on the outskirts, surrounded by trees and with a view of the mountains that stretched out as far as the eye could see. It was everything I had hoped for and more. The first few weeks were spent settling in, unpacking boxes, and exploring my new surroundings. I took long hikes through the woods, each step a reminder of the freedom I had fought so hard to reclaim. The peace and quiet of the mountains offered a stark contrast to the noise and chaos of the city, and I found myself embracing the solitude as a welcome change. One of the first things I did was set up a small studio in the cottage, a space dedicated to my photography. The room was bathed in natural light, perfect for capturing the beauty of the landscape around me. I began to experiment with new techniques, finding inspiration in the changing seasons and the ever-shifting light. Photography became not just a hobby, but a way to connect with my new environment, to document the journey of this fresh start. As the months passed, I found myself becoming a part of the community. The locals were warm and welcoming, and I started to build new relationships, though I took it slowly, savoring each new connection as it came. I volunteered at the local library and attended town events, slowly integrating myself into the fabric of the town. It was a new experience for me, one that was both humbling and rewarding. Despite the newness of it all, there were still moments of introspection. I often found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here, the pain and betrayal that had once seemed insurmountable. I would sit by the window in my studio, looking out at the mountains, and think about how far I had come. The landscape before me was a metaphor for my own journey, rugged and challenging at times, but ultimately beautiful and full of potential. One evening, while taking a walk along a forest trail, I met someone who would come to play a significant role in this new chapter. Her name was Laura, a fellow photographer who had moved to the town a few years earlier. We struck up a conversation about our mutual passion for photography, and she quickly became a friend and mentor. Laura had an easygoing nature and a wealth of experience in the field. She introduced me to the local photography community and invited me to participate in various projects and exhibitions. Through her, I not only expanded my network, but also gained valuable insights into my craft. Our friendship grew, and I found in her someone who understood my journey and shared my enthusiasm for capturing the world through a lens. The connection with Laura and the local community enriched my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. It was a reminder that despite the hardships I had faced, there was still beauty and opportunity to be found in the world. The small town had become more than just a backdrop for my new beginning. It had become a place where I could truly start over, where I could build a life that was meaningful and fulfilling. As the first year in the mountains drew to a close, I took stock of everything I had achieved. I had found a new home, a new purpose, and a renewed sense of self. The pain of the past had not vanished, but it no longer defined me. It had become a part of my story, one that had led me to this moment of renewal and growth. Looking ahead, I felt a sense of optimism that I hadn't known in years. The future was full of possibilities, and I was ready to embrace them. I had learned to let go of the things that no longer served me, to forgive those who had wronged me, and to find joy in the simple things. It was a new beginning, and for the first time in a long time, I was truly excited about what lay ahead. With each day that passed, I felt more grounded in my new life. The mountains had become a symbol of my journey, a reminder that even after the darkest times, there was always a path forward, always a chance for renewal. And as I looked out at the horizon, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, I was ready to face them with courage and hope.